The original goal was you secure Ukraine as quickly as possible. You set up your Quisling regime in Kiev. The thinking was there were plenty of Russian speakers. Nearly a third of the population speaks Russian fluently, mostly as their first language, and roughly a quarter of the population are actually ethnic Russians. So they thought they were going to be, to a degree, welcomed, at least in the East, and that they would not have to be going, building to building, leveling everything. Once they secured Ukraine, they would then grab Moldova, probably over a long weekend, because it's a country of 2.5 million people, and they already have some troops there in a secessionist province called Transnistria that they kind of created in the same way they created the Donbass republics. Once that is done, then they go into the 5 NATO countries. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are one of those gateways on the Baltic coast. That's how the Swedes have invaded in the past. Eastern Poland going up to the Vistula River in downtown Warsaw to plug the Polish gap, which is how the Germans have always liked to invade, and then going to the southwest a little bit to grab territory adjacent to Moldova and Ukraine that is in Romania to plug the Bessarabian gap, which has always been the Turkish approach. That's always what the Russians have needed for security.
In this video, geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan analyzes the situation in Ukraine and the Russian Federation's strategic objectives, while considering the larger geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe. Number 1. Strategic objectives. Zeihan outlines Russia's anticipated initial plan to quickly secure Ukraine, given the country's large population of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, whom they thought would offer less resistance. This would be followed by the annexation of Moldova and then further incursions into NATO countries, which are gateways to the rest of Europe. However, stronger Ukrainian resistance than expected has forced Russia to alter its tactics.
But because the Ukrainians have provided more of a resistance and seem to have a stronger national identity than the Russians had counted on, they are now applying tactics that they used first in Grozny and then that they later perfected in Aleppo in the civil war in Syria. And it's simply urban obliteration, to destroy every single piece of civilian infrastructure. Number one, to generate as many refugees as possible, because refugees don't fight, they run. And the more Ukrainians that you can get out of the cities and out of Ukraine, the better. So we've had 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees so far. It is the single largest refugee flow ever. You should count that 2.5 million going up at least to 10 over the course of the next couple of months, probably higher. The reason that the Russians are doing this civilian obliteration program is because if you have moved most of the population out, then when you do move in with troops, it's just shoot on sight for whatever you see. That's what they did in Grozny. That is what they did in Aleppo. And they will do this for every single population center that they come across. They're also doing it for every small city and town. Now, a couple things come from this. Number one, it means that the would-be guerrillas have very few places to hide, and the Russians can just assume that anyone who is still there is hostile. So it removes all the decision-making from the military. Second, if you obliterate the cities and towns, the farmers can't plant or harvest. So you generate a famine at the same time. And from the Russian point of view, the more dislocated, the more starving the population is, the less resistance they can generate. And this is what they're going to do for the entire country. That's already what they're doing for places like Mariupol and Mykolaiv and Kiev and Kharkiv. But it's going to be done everywhere.
Number 2. Tactics change. Due to unexpected resistance, Russia is implementing tactics of urban obliteration previously used in Grozny and Aleppo, aiming to create refugees and subsequently lower resistance. The rationale is that refugees do not fight, they flee. This tactic is intended to make subsequent incursions easier, reducing the need for discriminate action against civilian populations. Number 3. Possible outcomes. Zeihan suggests that the Russian strategy will likely result in the dislocation and starvation of the Ukrainian populace, thus weakening the potential for organized resistance. The ultimate goal is to control the territory, despite the tremendous humanitarian cost.
About 250,000 for active. Reserves is going to be closer to 10 million. Remember, this is a country that has a draft. So basically anyone under age 45 could be added to that reserve list if they feel it's necessary. So the Russian strategy going back to the early czars has been to expand until you hit those gateways. That means they've conquered a lot of people along the way. So the army goes in, gets rid of the regular resistance, and then the Interior Ministry forces go in and establish an information collection system and basically rule by terror. So once the conventional resistance in Ukraine is pacified, that's when the Interior Ministry troops will come in, and that's when things get really ugly. In the American experience, we've had gateway territories as well. Back before we and the Canadians kind of made up, the two big gateways were the Windsor-Detroit connection, the narrow point where the Great Lakes come together, and Lake Champlain, which provided maritime access across the border, and so you could use amphibious landings to go fairly deep into both territories. And so all of the treaties that we had with the Brits when Canada was still a British protectorate dealt with those two zones specifically. They were kind of our hot points, our own gateways going north-south. Now, that was obviously fixed.
Number 4, Interior Ministry forces. Zeihan highlights that once the regular resistance is subdued, the Russian Interior Ministry forces will likely come in and rule through an information collection system, effectively ruling by terror. This strategy, used by Russia historically, leads to a significant human rights abuses and suffering. Number 5, Strategic gateways and historical examples. Zeihan offers some historical examples of gateway territories, pointing out how important these have been in past conflicts. He suggests that Russia has 9 such gateways, all of which have been invasion routes in the past. Despite modern warfare technology, control of these gateways on the ground remains critically important for Russia.
Before the Civil War, so we haven't had to think about that. A more recent example would be, say, if you remember back to your Cold War history, you remember the Fulda Gap. It was a place in Germany where there was an opening in the Black Forest Mountains, and that is where we were always obsessed about the Russians coming through in mass, and so that was where we stationed a lot of tactical nukes for a worst-case scenario. The Russians have 9 of these, and they've always, every time they've been invaded, it's been through one of the 9. And I realize that in a world of hypersonic missiles, we don't think about this as much, but as we learned in Iraq, and as we learned in places like Lebanon, and as the Russians have learned in places like Grozny, if you can't secure the land, the rest of it just doesn't matter. From the Russian point of view, if they don't do this now, they will not have the demographic strength to resist a future invasion. And something that has happened in the last 3 weeks that I've got to admit has got me a little freaked out. Students of history, especially military history, always look to the example of the Nazi rise in 1936 and how from 1936 to 1939, 3 years, the Germans went from a destitute, depression-riddled Weimar Republic to the Nazi war machine. The capacity of a modern industrialized country, especially the modern industrialized countries that Russia is concerned about, to reinvent themselves overnight is huge.
Number 6, demographic considerations. Russia's demographic decline is noted as an impetus for its current actions. Russia is operating under the belief that if it does not secure these territories now, it won't have the demographic strength to resist future invasions. Number 7, global implications. Zeihan discusses the alarming prospect of a German military resurgence, drawing comparisons with the rapid militarization of Nazi Germany pre-World War II.